A very important point of discussion is optional chaining versus the forced unwrapping, and you cannot avoid them. If you're gonna code a simple iOS application, whether it's maybe 8, 9, 10, or maybe in the future in the Swift 3 or 4 or maybe 2, optional chaining and forced unwrapping are hard to avoid. They come side by side. So what does it mean for the optional chaining and forced unwrapping? Now, in some cases, we just design an app and that app doesn't have a default value. That the value might be coming from an online server, or it might be filled later on, or things like that, but there is no default value. And sometimes you cannot make a value as an empty string or zero or nil just like that. You are expecting a value. You need that value to run the further of your code, so you do need to find out whether that value is going to be available or not. So for that, I have already designed a simple code, but let's first discuss about the optional chaining and things like that. So when you specify optional chaining by placing a question mark, and you might have seen this quite a time, this is a question mark out there, and sometimes the exclamation mark is also there. So question mark simply means optional value or optional chaining, and the question and the simple exclamation mark means forced unwrapping. I repeat myself again. The question mark is optional unchaining or chaining, and the exclamatory mark is forced unwrapping. So sometimes you do want to call the values, properties, method with optional chaining and you're confused what is going to be happening. So here's the difference. The main difference is that optional chaining fails gracefully when the optional is nil, while the forced unwrapping triggers a runtime error when the optional is nil. So there is the difference. Okay, so the first forced unwrapping means if you use exclamatory sign, it's gonna produce a runtime error, while if you handle things with the question mark, it allows you to handle the error for a momentarily time. So let's analyze what this code is saying. So let's say I've defined a class game which has a value of life up. It's kind of a one up for the life, and it is dependent on another class which is life up, which might have a value or might not a value. So I have taken that it's a question mark, means it's simply an optional value out there. So when you do have an optional value and you try to forced unwrap it, and if the value is not there, it may fail up. Let me show you what I mean by that. So let me comment this part of the code and this part of the code as well. And now what's happening here is I have a game class which is having a life up value, which is completely optional because there's a question mark there. Then we have a life up here as well, which is another class and is having a number of life is equals to 1, so it adds 1 to your life. Okay, so now we have created a SAM, and which is being created as an instance of the game class. And let's just see what happens when I try to access the life up simple with this. So the life count, I'm trying to assign the value of the life count by using the sam.lifeup, and inside this life up I'm trying to access a value of number of lives, because again this is an instance here, so I can access this value here as well. So I'm trying to access it, but this time I'm making a forced unwrapping. I'm saying, hey, I'm pretty sure that this value is gonna appear. So let's just uncomment this, and we can see there's a fatal error. It says unexpectedly found nil while unwrapping an optional value. So it says yes, we were expecting an optional value and we do found a nil value, which is bad. So that's why I'm giving you a fatal error. So make sure you are pretty sure when you're unwrapping an optional value, you should be 100% sure that there will be no nil value. Otherwise your app is gonna crash and it's gonna give a fatal error. Now in some cases we do want our app to behave like this, but that's a very rare reasons. So let me just comment that again, and this time I'm gonna do a different thing. So what I'll be doing, so let me just uncomment this part. Now we can see again the value is actually nil. So but this time we are handling it differently. We are making an optional chaining, and the syntax is really simple. We use the if syntax and then we try to assign it to a constant. So this part is entirely a conditional, and it's only gonna be true when you do have some value. Otherwise, if it is the nil, it's gonna be false. So it says, and again this thing is gonna remain constant out there. It's a syntax. So if let, whenever you see that, that means you are trying to do some optional chaining there. So I'm trying to assign a life count value here, and that value is coming up from this life up, but it's an optional here, so that's why a question mark is there, and I'm not pretty sure whether it's gonna come up as a number or simply nil. In this case it's nil, so that's why the if part is not working, but the else part is working here. So we are handling our error pretty nicely. So the optional unchaining really gives you an authority to handle the errors. Now let me talk about this part, because a lot of new people just find out that this part is very confusing. So let's write a simple code out there, then I'll uncomment this guy. Okay, so let's just say that I do have some things, like for example I have a var a is equals to or let's just say, let's make this just like that, and this is just an explanatory code. Try to understand here. So if we do have an if statement and I put a condition a is equals to 10, now I know this should be equals 10, but notice a very interesting syntax here, and I'm gonna print a statement there, and I'm gonna simply be saying this is code. And notice what's happening here. This is saying that you should be using double equals. Now this is a good means, this is a very good thing about the Swift, but notice in most of the languages, when you will do things like that, if you want to assign something here, always and always this code is going to be running. But in this case, unfortunately, the Swift 3 and Xcode 8 is really smart enough to make an error that it should not be happening. But in case, if you put a let here, and I just put a let here and just uncomment this or comment this, let me just make it. Okay, so now what is happening, I'm trying to produce a value if let a equals 10. Now again, it's not gonna say, because it says initializer for conditional binding must have an optional int and not int. So we'll talk about that later on. Right now just try to understand that since I'm assigning a value to it, that means we are done. We have assigned a value, that means it's always gonna be true, and that's what's happening here. Now obviously you need to have an optional type of value, and this is the reason why we are getting an error here, because it is saying that I am expecting an optional type, not an int type, and there is a difference between optional int and int. So let me comment this out for a moment, and right now this syntax is exactly as the syntax as we have here. This is just simplified. So it says that let life count equals this, and this time we are passing an optional int value, not a similar int. It's an optional int because this is what's happening here. And there we go. I know it was a pretty tough explanation to explain it, but as a matter of fact, if you haven't got it, do repeat the video, because this is going to be whole heart of the programming in the Swift. Optional chaining are hard to avoid. You will find them everywhere in the Swift and iOS 10. So let me summarize things again. So when we do a forced unwrapping, means we use an exclamatory sign. It does a forced unwrapping, means your app is prompt to get crash if it is going to find a value of nil. While on the other side, if you do a question mark, that means it's simply going to say, hey, you may find the value or you may not find the value. And that's why we are doing an optional chaining. We are saying if you are able to assign a value into it, that means consider this as a true part and run this code. And otherwise, if you find a nil value, then just print some other message out here. That's the whole story. Now just on to some other part, I have written a simple line of code. I can just point this and can run this code as well. And we found an error. Let me fix that. And for that, I have to actually uncomment this guy, because this is an exclamatory here, forced unwrapping. This is gonna get us an error. And now when my life up is actually having a value of 1, this line of code is running, because now it is not nil, it is having some value. Again, too much of the confusion, but don't worry, repeat the value. I'll just summarize again. Exclamatory means you may get error, you will not get a chance to handle that error. Question marks means optional chaining, that means you're gonna get time to deal up with the error. That's what it's all about. So it was a great movie about the optional chaining and versus the forced unwrapping.